So now I'd like to talk to you about card making if maybe you're an intermediate crafter. So once you've learnt the basics of card making, you can start increasing the skill level and using different techniques. I mean, these could be techniques such as shaping your cards, adding in things like decoupage and beautiful embellishments that maybe you haven't tried before. You can start adding layering effects and different colour combinations too. So there's lots of different ways to start expanding your knowledge. We'll have a look now at some of the tools that you might think are useful for creating some of these beautiful techniques. So if we pop these to the side, some of my essentials that I've now come to use are things like a distressing tool. This is fantastic for adding a ruffled edge around a piece of cardstock or paper. And we've also got here, this is a Pokey Tool. Okay, so it's very sharp. But what it does, it's a tool to help you pick things up, to poke holes in for maybe faux stitching. It helps you to release die cuts from your die if you venture into die cutting later on. So it's a very useful tool to have for many different things. So then we have colouring pens or pencils, or you could look at watercolours maybe. Now I have here chameleon colour pens. You can use lots of different ones. There's some that will blend, there's some that will stick to different surfaces, lots and lots on the market. But they are almost the next essential after your basics to start adding colour to your projects. So then I also have here, I have a blending sponge. Now this can be used instead of a brush for spreading ink around, so blending ink. Now this is very useful if you want to use it with a stencil, but you can also use it to add distressing to the edges of cards. You can also use this to create beautiful backgrounds. So then along with your distressing techniques, you've also got these items here. Now these are various powders and materials that will just add detail and maybe sparkle to your project. So we have here, this is called extra fine glitter. Now glitter comes in every shade imaginable. Some is fine and some is much thicker. So it's kept in a pot and you would use an adhesive to stick this down. So this could be actually stuck down in some very tiny little pieces there, just to add highlights to your project. We then have something called embossing powder. So this is a powder just a bit like glitter, but it's usually matte. But when it's heated, it will then turn into, it looks like molten silver or molten metal. It's a beautiful effect, and I'll be showing you that later. Alongside this, you will also need to use a heat gun too. And then lastly, we have something called Gilding Wax. Now this is almost in a liquid form. It's a solid form, but it's very soft. And you can actually apply it with your finger, with a brush, with a blending foam, and it's a bit like a paint. So it will add a beautiful gold or silver, whichever colour it is, effect to chosen parts of your project, just to highlight them. So lastly, I'd like to move on to just stamping, because your stamping tools can get a little confusing, but I want to take you through the basics. So first of all, an ink pad. And I would recommend starting with a pigment ink pad, because it won't dry too quickly for you, so you can work with it then. And then we have a clear acrylic block. Now these come again in lots of different sizes, and many of the packs that you can buy will have multiple sizes in them. But it's a solid block made of plastic that you can see through for where you're stamping. And you'll see on here I've attached something called a clear stamp. So this is a piece of rubber that has a recessed edge in the design of your chosen stamp. And the rest of your stamps will come on a clear sheet like so. And usually you have the black lines on the packaging so you can see exactly how your stamp will print when it's used. Very, very lastly, one I almost forgot, but I think is essential, is a sanding block. Now this could be in various forms. Some people like to use just a regular nail file. This is one where you can tear off the pieces of sandpaper, and some people actually buy large blocks as you would if you were decorating your home to use. Now this could be used with your embossing techniques, it could be used to sand back paint or ink, or it could be used to distress those edges as well. So once you've mastered your basic techniques, there's a few more techniques that you can use to build on your creativity and to make your projects even more amazing. Now, we've talked before about using colouring pens, and I just want to show you how you would incorporate those into your projects. So, for example, here I have a stamped image. Now, this could be an image of absolutely anything, but I think it needs some colour. So I would take one of my pens and just start colouring in between the lines. Now, what this is going to do is just bring this stamped image to life. Now, various pens work in different ways. You've got some that you can actually blend together with each other. You've got some that perhaps you can actually change the colour with. For example, these ones, if I take the lid off, I can actually change the tone of the colour with these. You've got some that will react with water, so you can use them almost as a watercolour pen. You've got some pens that will leave a raised image as well, so it will look as if it's bumpy on the surface or glossy, and it may be an effect that you're after. So next, let's take you through distressing. So there's lots of different ways of adding distressing to your projects, and I like to use distressing mostly around the edges of my cards. So there's two ways in which you can do that depending on the strength of the distressing that you want. So when I have a piece of coloured cardstock and I want a softer look to it, I will use my distressing tool. So if you pop the edge of your cardstock into where the blades are on this tool and just run them along, you'll start to notice how that is scuffing it up like so. But another way to add distressing is with some ink. Now, this could be brown ink or it could be black ink. It could be any colour as long as it's sort of darker and a vintagey look usually. Now, I'm going to use a blending sponge, or you could call it a blending foam. So I've applied ink to the edge of my sponge and I'm just going to carefully brush that along the edge of my card base here. Eventually what you'll get is a lovely edge that looks almost as if it's burnt. So keep working around there. And you can see when I pop my cardstock on there, we have that distressed image there. So lastly, I'd like to talk to you about heat embossing. Now, this is a fantastic technique that makes any of your embellishments look like metal. You can do beautiful embossing techniques on backgrounds as well, and you need three simple tools. So you'll need an ink pad, and ideally this should be a pigment ink pad that won't dry too quickly. You'll need embossing powder. Now, this would not work with something like a glitter. You do need to make sure it is called embossing powder, and there's lots of different brands on the market available for you. And then you need a heat gun. So what will happen is you will stamp or you will apply ink to your cardstock, and then you will sprinkle over the powder, and the powder will only stick where the ink is. You'll then tap off the excess, heat it with the gun, and that will melt your powder to look like molten metal. It's a beautiful, beautiful effect and well worth trying if you have yourself a heat gun and embossing powder. So now let me show you a project using that heat embossing technique. So here's a die cut that I've pre-cut this. This could be a hand cut image, but you can see it's black at the moment, and I'd like to change it so it looks like metal or maybe silver. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to place this onto a piece of scrap cardstock. Now we can see I've already got some ink on there, so I know this is a scrap piece. I'm going to apply an ink, a pigment ink ideally, all over the die cut. Now this is where you can pick and choose whereabouts your embossing powder is going to stick, because you can ink the entire image, or you could actually just ink a little bit of it. If you ink very lightly, you will have more of a speckled effect rather than everything covered in powder. Right, so I think that is almost fully covered there. I'm now going to turn this over onto a clean bit of cardstock and sprinkle with embossing powder. Although I'm using a pigment ink that won't dry too quickly, I do want to work as fastly as I can because you don't want to risk anything drying there. So I'm going to use a Pokey Tool here, and I'm just going to scoop up the die cut. Let me do it this way round. Pick it up, give it a little tap and make sure that the excess is off of there. I'm going to lay that down onto my glass mat. There we go. I'm going to tip my excess powder back into my pot. This is very important because otherwise you'll find you're using it up far too quickly, or you may knock it everywhere and make a mess. We'll just pop that in there and then the lid back on firmly. So now we're going to heat this up. Now you do need to use a special heat gun. You can't use a hairdryer for this because a hairdryer doesn't reach as high a temperature and will just blow all your powder everywhere. Now a heat gun is quieter, the heat comes out slower and at a much higher temperature. So I'm going to hold my die cut still by placing a pokey tool through one of the gaps in it. I'm going to turn the heat on my heat gun and just wait for it to heat up before I apply it. And as I apply it, you'll see the powder melting. There we go. So you can see that melting, and I was holding it still with my pokey tool. And now we can lift that up, and that is dry within a few seconds. So you can see there, that is now dry and almost cooled down already. And it looks like it's now a metal and embellishment, which is beautiful. So I'm just going to place this onto the front of one of my cards, and I think that makes an amazing card without any other embellishment. So I've just glued down the centre of the horse there, leaving the tail and the head and the legs free. And then we have a beautiful card. So next I'm going to take you through some distressing techniques. So let's pop this to the side. Now these are techniques that you can use on any card, and you can base them around your embellishments as well. So these are usually used on your background, but you can bring them to the forefront as well, as I'm going to. So we've discussed adding brown ink to distress some edges, and we've discussed using the distressing tool. So I'm going to do that again on this. So I've got a little piece of matting and layering, and this is just slightly smaller than my card front. I'm going to scuff up as such the edges around this card, like so. So there's one piece of cardstock that is now distressed and ready to go onto my card base. I'm going to apply some tape to the back of it and pop that down. The next layer I have is brown, so I thought I would add some brown around the edge of this. I'm going to do that rather than using my sponge. I'm going to use a brush because it adds a lighter effect, it's gentler. So I'm just brushing from my ink pad. I'm bringing that ink over onto the edge of my circle here, but I'm actually applying the ink first onto my glass mat. So a smooth surface that's wipeable like a glass mat, or maybe a heat resistant mat, is fantastic to work on. If you don't have any of those yet, you could use something like a cello bag just to move that ink about onto your cardstock. So if I now hold that up for you, you can see the effect that we've got from doing that. And we're going to glue that onto the front of our card as well. So I'm going to very quickly do the same two techniques on these panels. I might even add a purpose tear here and there as well. So you can go in and purposely just tear a little bit and bend it round like so, just to add even more structure to that. And I'm just adding some brown ink to my white panel here, just like we did with the craft circle. Now I'm going to stick my white panel onto my green, but before I put my green down, what I'm going to do is add one more thing underneath here to really bring that up and distress it. And this is something I absolutely love, and it's called cheesecloth. You can also buy some gauze, some medical gauze, which is readily available in supermarkets as well. But if you pull this, it's got lots and lots of weave in it, and we can add this as a layer underneath our panels, underneath our matting and layering. These are going to help with that distressed look. And then I'm going to place that on there and that on top. Now it's a good idea actually to store your glue bottles on their side, and that way the glue is always there ready and available at the nozzle for you to use. So just before you glue that down, make sure you position your cheesecloth where you're happy with it. There's a little bit there. And that your sentiment in the middle is straight. Lastly, for these intermediate techniques, I'd like to show you a combination of stamping and then colouring your stamped image. So for this, I've got here a clear stamp, and I'm going to stamp it onto my smooth cardstock. Please use smooth because textured cardstock will leave marks or missed parts in your stamped image. I'm going to place my clear stamp onto a block. Now, these are also known as cling stamps because they do cling on by themselves, okay? Now, if these get dirty, one way to clean them and sort of revive that cling again is just to wash them with warm soapy water and allow them to air dry, and you'll find they'll stick to the blocks again very quickly. Now, I'm going to ink this with a black ink. This one is called VersaFine. It is a pigment ink which would be perfect for our heat embossing that we've seen. And what this is different for is it's giving you a really clear, defined image when you're stamping. So I'm going to place the stamp over my cardstock. Now I rest the block on there for a moment and then I press all over the stamped image. I'm not pressing on the edges. If you do that, you can rock your block, and what actually happens is you're staggering your stamped image, then it can move and not give you the clear impression that you're looking for. So press that all down and then lift that up, and you can see that we've actually got a beautiful, beautiful image there stamped. It looks as if it's been printed out professionally, really stunning. So now we're going to colour this in. Now you can do this with lots of different mediums. You can use paints, you could use pencils. My favourite is to use colouring pens. Now personally I like to use chameleon pens. These come in lots of different colours. Now what you'll find with a lot of colouring pens is that you can actually buy them in packs of 4, 6, 8, 12, sometimes even larger packs. But they will actually be stacked together in colour combinations. So you might be buying your neutrals, or you might be buying your brights or your pastels. And this just helps you to build up your collection, determined on what sort of colours you like to use. So now I can go in with my colour. So first of all, I have here a pink. Now a lot of pens you'll find also, they have 2 different tips to them. And these ones do as well. So what these are allowing you to do is either to go in with a precision tip, as this one is, which is you find it's a much firmer nib, and there we go, and it's more pointy on the end. And then you'll also have on the other end a brush nib. So this one is more for doing your larger work, as you can see. So there's that. So pick and choose your colours before you get started. So pick some that all work together. So I've chosen quite cool shades here. So I've got purples, pinks and blues. Now don't forget as well, these will be determined by the papers that you're using to maybe matte and layer onto your card. So I'm just going to glue these panels down quickly. And then to finish it off, as I was saying about adding glitter just to highlight elements of an image, I'm just going to show you how I would do that. So I'll mat this onto my frame and then lastly onto the card base. Always make sure your card opens the correct way before you stick anything down, because it's very easy to get that wrong. And then I'm going to take my glue, and along this grey line that I've added, I'm just going to add a tiny little line of glue along there, very carefully. And lastly, I'm going to take a little pinch of glitter. I'm going to sprinkle it over that glue. Now you can go right over the edge, use excess glitter here, you don't have to just cover the glue, and then we'll tip that into the pot. Brush off any excess. There we go, and then we have our glittery vase of flowers. So I hope these tips and techniques have helped you to expand your crafting knowledge and build up your confidence in trying new things.